All right.
Great, thank you. Hi, everybody. Welcome to the ACRL Instruction Section Teaching Method Committee's virtual event, Improve Your Instruction with Classroom Assessment Techniques. It's a conversation with Melissa Bowles-Terry and Cassandra Queneld. This webinar is being recorded. You can watch it later and share the recording with colleagues who may also be interested. Please feel free to enter questions in the chat as we're talking. We'll address the questions at the end, but we don't want you to forget anything that you might want to ask as you're listening to the conversation. When you send your messages, change the Send To menu to all participants. If you don't have all participants, please feel free to change that to all panelists, and we'll keep track of the questions that are coming in. To begin, let me introduce our guests today. Actually, let me stop quickly. I just got a message from one person who said that the audio is going in and out for him. It sounds like it was on his end, but if you're able to send the message to Elois, she may be able to help you troubleshoot the sound on your end. So to begin, oh good, I'm glad to hear that it's working out okay as far as most other folks sound. So to begin, let me introduce our guests today. Melissa Bowles-Terry is the Head of Educational Initiatives at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas Libraries. Cassandra Queneld is the Head of the Learning Resource Center at the University of Wyoming Libraries. And together they wrote Classroom Assessment Techniques for Librarians, published by ACRL in 2015. Finally, I'm the moderator for this session today. My name is Amanda Eisenstark, and I'm the Reference and Instructional Design Librarian at the University of Rhode Island. So a brief overview of today's session. What we're going to have after our introduction is about 35 minutes of a formal Q&A with Cassandra and with Melissa, and then we'll have time to take questions from the audience. So I think we'll just double check. Is everything sounding okay so far? Great. All right, so then we'll go ahead, and I'll start with the first question. And either Melissa or Cass, you can take it on. You may want to introduce yourself so our audience knows which one of you is which, because when I'm talking, the camera's on me. So the first question that I have for you both today is how does classroom assessment fit into an overall assessment strategy for an instruction program?
Sure. So this is Melissa. And I'm not sure that I have video. Do you see me? No? All right. Well, I apologize. I assure you the lighting is very nice in my office and all that jazz. Amanda, could you go to our next slide?
Sure thing.
Thank you.
Maybe. Let's find out. That should do it.
Thanks. So classroom assessment is a learner-centered formative assessment practice. And the main purpose is to allow instructors to find out what students are learning in the classroom and how well they're understanding it. When we say learner-centered, we mean that it's assessing what students know or what they can do as opposed to a teacher-centered evaluation. It doesn't assess student satisfaction with the instructors or with the teaching methods. And by formative, we mean that it assesses student learning on an ongoing basis. It helps students target the areas where they need more work, and it helps instructors and librarians see where students are struggling, and then we can address problems sooner rather than later. It's quite different from summative assessment, which would take the form of a final exam or a final project where it's higher stakes, and that would evaluate student learning at the end of an instructional unit in order to give a grade or even a degree. So classroom assessment techniques are just one part of an overall assessment strategy, and it's the part that can really focus on improvement and development of both instructors and of students. We do find that you can get actionable data for sure, but it's not necessarily going to prove value in an overall kind of way, but it can be one part of showing the impact of an instruction program.
Great. Cass, do you have any thoughts or comments on this one?
The only thing I would add is that Melissa and I were both heavily inspired by the work of Angelo and Cross, who wrote the book Classroom Assessment Techniques. And it was really geared toward an academic audience generally. So it is designed for classroom teachers in all the disciplines. And we'll have information about that at the end of the session today. But I never want to present our work without giving a shout out to Angelo and Cross for all of their pioneering work that was very influential and inspiring to us.
Great. Yeah, that's a really fantastic book, and yes, there's more information about that at the end. We also had a question about whether the slides would be shared, so the slides will be shared as well. Thank you both. Cass, would you want to go first with this one since Melissa went first before? What are your go-to assessment techniques?
Well, if you'd be kind enough to go to the next slide.
Sure thing.
I was excited. I told Melissa I would just pick this whole question because I get excited talking about these. So the number one classroom assessment technique that I use the most is the minute paper. And I know there's a ton of participants, but I'm going to look at the list and have everybody raise your hands if you've used this before. We'll just see how many people raise their hands. Yeah, I'm seeing some hands go up. And I like to think that this is partly because it's such a great assessment technique. And one of the things I love about the minute paper is that you can use it in a one-shot session for library instruction. So it doesn't require a ton of access to students or a ton of time. And it doesn't require a ton of resources. Basically, you can ask students to take a half sheet of paper and answer 2 questions. What was the most important thing you learned today? And what questions are still unanswered? You'll see a variant of that on our slide. Truthfully, you can vary the way you ask this question a lot of ways. I like to ask sometimes, what was the most surprising thing you learned? Or what was the most interesting thing you learned? This is a really quick check for understanding with students to make sure that they can recall what you've taught and that they can summarize it effectively. And it also indicates what remains unanswered, where there is still some confusion on the part of students. I always like to be sensitive to different modes of teaching. This can easily be translated from the half sheet of paper into an online environment. I've used this lots of times in discussion boards, and it's kind of perfectly set up to use in a discussion board on Canvas or Blackboard or something like that. Sometimes when using the minute paper, I skip the first question and I do a variation called the muddiest point, where I say, what is the muddiest point? What's still really confusing? And I just collect that information from students. And we'll talk a little bit more today about how to utilize the information you get from these assessment techniques. Another one of my favorites is the background knowledge check, and I'm guessing some of you have seen this one too. This one is most effective. Oh, can I have you switch the slide, Amanda? Thanks.
Sure thing.
This one is really most effective if you can do it before the students ever meet with you. So if you can send this to the instructor, whether you do that in the form of a multiple choice piece of paper that they administer in class, whether it's an online poll, whether it's a discussion thread online or a concept map, it really doesn't matter how you structure it. What you're getting at is all the varied knowledge and skills that students are bringing with them to the library. And you want to get a sense of where everybody's at before you structure your instruction. I value this one a lot because I've worked with a ton of adult learners and returning students. Often I work with classroom teachers who are coming back to get graduate degrees. Well, some of them have used the library extensively in recent years, and others haven't used the library in 20 years. So this background knowledge check helps me determine where to place my instruction for those folks. And I really like this. It kind of gets at the gap between what students know and what they kind of know. That's really what I'm looking for in this. What can we reinforce and where can we provide some new value to students? The final go-to instruction technique I want to talk about, I do not have a slide for because we're going to look at it more in depth a little later in the session. But it's the transfer and apply technique. And it asks students to recall new knowledge and then apply that to their own environment. And that's a nice way to get at the idea of Okay, you're in the library, you learned how to use this for this one assignment or this one research topic, but what are you going to do with this information in the future? How are you going to structure your research patterns differently, knowing what you know now? So that's another really good one. And like I said, we'll look at that more closely at the end of the session.
Great. Yeah, there was a question, is this on the next slide? It'll be talked about in a few minutes. Great. Melissa, did you want to take any of this on, or?
No, Cass and I talked about some of
Sure.
our favorites, so yeah, those are
great.
the things we both like to use.
One of the things I also find helpful about the background knowledge check is it kind of primes people to learn about these things as well. So you have students saying, well, I haven't heard of this. Maybe it's something I need to know about, kind of thing. So
that's so great, Amanda. And you know what else it does so well is prompt students to recall. Like, oh yeah, I have done this before. I remember now.
Yeah, sometimes, especially with returning students, if they've had time off, all of a sudden it's like, oh yeah, I did that years ago. How do I do it now? And it reinforces it. That's great. So the next question we have for you is, how do you adjust your assessment strategies or your tools for different class sizes, different levels, or different durations of classes?
Mm-hmm. So this is Melissa, and a great thing about these strategies is that they are really adjustable and really flexible. That's part of the beauty of the classroom assessment techniques. And since they include brief responses usually, they're even scalable for very large classes. So you're not collecting a lot of information from every student, so you can do it with big groups. We included a lot of examples in the book of ways that you can adapt this online. We certainly find that as technology improves and more people are comfortable creating, small digital learning objects or brief tutorials, CATs can really be built into those as reusable digital content. Then you can embed it into a course management system or use it in any kind of a class response system. So you can sort of, like scale it up for big classes, do it online for online classes. But with all that said, we also would want you to note that paper and pencil work great for face-to-face classroom assessment techniques. There's definitely no need to go high-tech for a minute paper. So in terms of adjusting for, big classes, small classes, that's definitely doable. Cass talked about the background knowledge check or the confidence check and how that's especially useful for adult learners. But really for learners at all different levels, it's nice to show them that you're adjusting for their level of experience. You're taking into account what they already know. You acknowledge that they have experience with these things. And it does require you to make adjustments on the fly, but it really is a respectful way, we find, of dealing with students because it's asking them in advance, what do you know and what do you want to know? So that's definitely a nice thing for adjusting to different levels because there will be people in the class who've had more experience and who've had less. Then you can sort of divide into groups and students can learn from each other. And then in terms of adjusting for different durations, you can choose a low prep, easy to deliver classroom assessment technique if you've only got a few minutes. There are a lot of quick ways like a 1-minute paper or another really brief way of asking for some input that won't take much of your precious time if you only have a limited amount of time with a class.
Great. Yeah, sort of adding to this, I just have a quick question. When you are dealing with a large class and you're doing some sort of assessment, how do you go through all of that stuff?
Mm-hmm. Well, there are different ways of delivering it. So if you use like a class response system like Poll Everywhere or iClicker or something, then you can just kind of get instantaneous results. If you're doing something like a quick background knowledge check or even, a 1-minute paper and then make a word cloud out of the responses to see what sort of commonly comes up. So you can do that with that kind of response system. If you're collecting more information, like at the end of a class, having students write on an index card, a transfer and apply kind of exercise, what did you learn and how are you going to use it, then sorting through those responses, can take some time. we came up with like some sample rubrics of like, you know, students who really got it, students who are a little muddy, and students who need follow-up. You know, you can just sort of quickly sort them into 3 piles and deal with them that way. So you do have to be a little creative, I would say, dealing with a lot of responses. But it's important to plan time for it, not just in the classroom, but then afterwards. Like make a plan for what you're going to do with those results so you don't just chuck them in a drawer.
Right. No, that's great. I think that's an important thing because so much emphasis is placed on planning it, and the allotting time for follow-up is also very important.
This is Cass. I saw a great question in the chat about what do you do if the background knowledge check shows that some people know a lot and other folks are really less prepared. And I think that's a tricky issue. In the past, I've had success kind of separating a class even and saying, hey, you guys, I'm going to get you started, get rolling, call me over if you need help, and then spending more time with the other folks on the fundamentals. That has to be handled kind of delicately, but students are generally happy not to have their time wasted and to receive extra attention if they need it. And there was another question, too, about having a slide that shows some of the rubrics. We do not have that on the slide. They're definitely in the book. And if you shoot us an email, we'd be happy to send you some examples, too. Oh, and also with the background knowledge checks, we'll talk a little bit more about how to follow up with instructors and provide supplemental materials so that if folks aren't all on the same page for whatever reason, you can kind of catch those that have a little less preparation.
Great. Thank you. So the next question I have for you is, what technique or techniques do you wish you could use more?
Well, this is Cass, and I might out myself as being ill-prepared or lazy in my instruction approach here when you hear the ones I wish I could use more. The first one, and I have a slide for this one, Amanda, is called RSQC2. And this one is really utilized to reinforce what was taught in the last class. And so this involves having ongoing contact with the same students over time and devoting enough of a follow-up class session to perform the assessment. And often I don't feel like I have that much time with students to build this in. That said, it is really, really great for those people teaching credit courses because you ask students to recall the most important things they learned in the last session. So that's kind of like the minute paper, only there's a time lag. You also can ask them to summarize the important points into one sentence. Write down some questions that they still have, kind of the muddiest point again with the time lag. Connect that to the goals for the whole course or the whole research project or whatever you're working with them on. And then write some evaluative comments for you about what they thought about it. This one takes a little bit more time to prepare, and it also takes more time for the students to fill in. But it can be extraordinarily helpful to find out how much your students really recalled from the last session. And I've heard some stories about these where students remembered the strangest things, sort of one-off items that you threw in to keep people awake, and that was what they took out of the class. So this is a powerful assessment technique in terms of fine-tuning your own teaching and staying on method. But again, it just takes a little more time than librarians always have. The next one is the goal ranking and matching, and I do have a slide for that one too.
Great. Move over to that one.
And the trick with this one, this is where I will out myself as sometimes ill-prepared, is that you really need to implement this before the class starts, whatever that looks like. And you ask students to brainstorm a list of what they want to learn and what their goals are for the class, whether it's over time or a one-shot. And after they've done that, ask them to rank those goals. And then finally, you match that with your own goals as the instructor and take a look at whether or not you're on the same page. This does require some flexibility. There's a couple ways this can go. One is that students want to learn something you weren't really prepared to cover, but that you think is important and you should include. So that requires flexibility on your part. The other way I've seen this go is that students want to learn way more than the time allows. So they want to get from point A, topic selection, to point Z, ready to write my paper tonight. So sometimes it's just about setting some reasonable expectations for what you're going to achieve. Again, if you're teaching a credit course, I love this assessment technique. We've all sat through various ways of covering the material on the syllabus and, you know, rolled our eyes and as students and cursed students for not reading the syllabus as instructors. And it's kind of a painful exercise. And this is a way to cover some of the syllabus in an interactive way that values student voice and lets them have some say in the process and gives you a sense of what they really are there for, what they're really interested in. So I love that one as well. Are there any questions about those two? I have one more example, but I'll take some examples. Oh, I see one here. Is the ranking done by the class or the individual student? Either way, you can really adapt these to whatever works for your teaching style in your classroom. Great question. Oh, I see another question about using the assessment technique to barter more time from instructors. Absolutely. In fact, that's the next, we've got a question coming up exactly about that. But spoiler alert, yeah, that's a great way to use these.
Great.
I'll share my final example of one I would like to use more, and that's research logs. And basically, you ask students to record how they spend their time researching. So this is an at-home assessment technique. Ask them what kind of strategies they're using, what questions are coming up for them as they're researching, what problems they're encountering. And this really promotes some metacognition. It makes students hyper aware of the process, which builds good research behaviors and reflection for them, which is such a great outcome. I think it's really valuable, more valuable than the search results, really. And it also can tell you some things about your systems and what's working and what's not that you can share with other folks at your library. I guess my confession here is that I assign these all the time, and I don't always collect them. I don't really have time. And what I want students to get is the reflection piece and those good habits. What I do, though, is if I get good examples of these, I save them for later use, and I share them with students as well and say, hey, look at this beautiful research log. This is the kind of preparation you want to be doing before you embark on your research. So I think they can be a really great teaching tool for future students as well.
Great. How about you, Melissa?
So one that I would really like to use more is also the goal ranking and matching, and I have this dream of using it to get really meaningful feedback. I used it when I was teaching a credit-bearing information literacy class and used it just in the way that Cass suggested on the first day with the syllabus, like take a close look at the syllabus, list your goals, and then see if our goals match. But the feedback that I got from students when I was teaching that particular class was pretty superficial in terms of their goals, and I think to make this a really meaningful and really useful activity, you would need to do it in sort of a repeated way and maybe, you know, like later in the semester. And I think that in that sense, it could be, with a repeated effort, with more flexibility, it could be really meaningful. So that's one that I'm going to use again at a future date, and I'm going to do it better next time because I think it could be really powerful.
Great. So let's move on to some of the challenges. We've got all sorts of great ideas here. So what challenges do you face with assessment, either personally or with your institution?
So this is Melissa. Time is the thing that everybody says in response to this question, right? Both making time in the classroom and then making time to respond to the results and make changes. That's the tricky thing. So assessment of any type takes planning, and classroom assessment techniques may seem really like easy peasy, we can fit this in, but even with something like classroom assessment, I think that you have to make a plan so that you are addressing all parts of the assessment cycle. Like, what is it that you want to know? How are you going to gather evidence? What are you going to do with the evidence? And then how will you make changes and implement this great new information that you've gained. So even though, it may seem like you're just asking students what they got out of it, do think through the whole plan and process of what you're going to do with the information. Otherwise, it won't be a useful activity for you or for your students. So make a plan and make the time both at the beginning and at the end. I think that's a major challenge. And the specific challenge for me has been making time for the follow-up, for sure. I've been definitely guilty of having students do something in class or before class and then not demonstrating the follow-through that I should have. So, for example, if you have students do muddiest point, kind of activity, one of the really useful things you can do for that class is then take, the 5 or 6 most common questions and just send out an email or make a quick guide that addresses like, all right, we had a great session and here are the 5 most common questions coming out of it that I would love to, give you some extra information on. We can have a consultation, but that kind of follow-up can be really helpful. So in real life, you're asking about challenges with assessment. So in real life, I tend to rely on the lower preparation classroom assessment techniques. And then the higher preparation ones get used a little less in real actual practice. But it's a good challenge to have, I think, as you gather information about how students are learning, figure out ways to make use of that to follow up on. That's the big challenge, I would say.
Yeah, I can agree. One of the things, we're a Google Apps for Education institution, or Google Suite is what it is now, and I will often do a pre-class survey in Google Forms so that I can get the students' email addresses. Then it's just a matter of copying and pasting that into the BCC field along with the instructors, the subject instructor's email address. That way he or she sees that I'm following up with the students, and it gives me a quick way of dealing with those like loose ends that come up as a result of some of these assessments.
Amanda, I would just build on that by saying you hit on 2 really important points. One is that all of these are easier to implement and follow up on if you have a really good collaborative relationship with the instructor and you're built into the class in a meaningful way. That makes creating these, administering them, and following up so much easier. And generally, the instructors are interested to know what you've learned as well. And the second piece is to use those existing technologies that your school has, whether it's a Google Form or LibWizard in your SpringShare product or just an in-house survey tool or whatever it is that your online course system provides. If you can build these assessment techniques in a way that you can reuse them or the content's there, that can actually save a lot of time and make analyzing the results a lot easier.
Yeah, exactly, and that saves, on my end, it saves a ton of time when I am doing that because it gives me, I can actually just go do a report, a spreadsheet, which I can share with the instructor, and the instructor is so thrilled to see what did the students say about the session. What do I need to follow up on? So that's great. Thank you. Any other comments before we move on? Oh, what challenges at your institution? Do you have any of those that you want to share, or would you like to move on to the next question?
I think we're ready for the next.
All right. So how do you use these great assessment results that you're getting?
So this is Cass, and I'll follow up on some of what Melissa said. The number one thing is to follow up in the moment. Let students know you read the results and how you're going to act on them, and let the instructor know you've read the results and how you're going to act on them. That's the most important thing, and what that looks like will be different depending on what the results were. So often, even if it's a one-shot, I've used those results to create supplemental materials for students. So that could be a video, it could be an online guide, it could be just an email to the class saying, oh, hey, it sounded like some of you were still confused about this. Here's the path to that information. Just a reminder, you can call me. Something like that. It could be that simple. I loved the comment that we got in the chat box about using this to get more time with students, face-to-face time, or time in an online class. And that is really effective. In fact, I would say we were just talking about challenges. To me, that's been a challenge. Our instructional staff has decreased significantly at Wyoming in the past 2 years. So I always need to be a little bit careful about, here's what your students still need to learn. Not sure I can come teach it. So I realize there might be other of you that are looking for more work, looking for more instruction, but that's not always the case. So I rely a lot on those supplemental materials. And sometimes students are focused on what they need to be focused on, which is their research. And they will then follow up in the minute paper or in an RSQC2 kind of thing, and say, you know, I still am really struggling with how to deal with my sources and citations. And then I might invite them to our citation management workshop, or I might share with them an online guide to get them set up with RefWorks. So sometimes there's supplemental material already in place that we can use to follow up. The other big thing we do with results is change our lesson plans for next time. And you can use this kind of strategically. I have in the past used 2 different lesson plans for like a freshman English class, and then took a look at the formative assessment results and decided to stick with one approach over the other based on what students took away. So you can use it to improve your own teaching planning, even if those individual students don't necessarily benefit.
Yeah, that's great. It's one of the things I do as well is I use that information to sort of build the next round, especially because sometimes it might be a year between delivery of a session, and you're not alone as far as a sort of a smaller instructional staff. We're in the same boat, and so it's getting that second session can be a blessing or a curse depending on your situation.
We had a question here. What if you try a workshop as a follow-up, but no one comes, right? That's always a bummer. And I've been there for sure. I think that you have to think about sustainability too. Like if you get a comment as a follow-up, like I really wanted to know more about citation management, can you create a guide or a video that will give students an introduction to that, and then serve as a supplement to maybe an in-person workshop as a follow-up. But think about ways that you can reuse content. And then we also have a question, do you do summative assessment in your sessions? And there are some of these classroom assessment techniques that are summative, like a pre and a post check about what students know. You do a background knowledge check and then sort of repeat at the end to see what they know. That is a bit more summative. But what we have found with classroom assessment techniques for librarians in particular is so much of what we do is time limited. As much as we may move away from one-shots towards being more course integrated or towards being more embedded, much of what we do is limited in time. And so the change that we see over time, which is what you're usually measuring with summative, is pretty small. Summative assessment is really best at the end of a semester or the end of a degree program. So it's a bit different from what we tend to do in classroom assessment techniques.
Great. Thank you. So this kind of ties into some of the stuff we were saying earlier, or talking about earlier. What have you changed based on your assessment results?
Well, this is Cass, and I think we've kind of covered this pretty well, but I will share just sort of a personal anecdote about this. I was doing some classroom assessment techniques with nursing students, and they were working in an evidence-based practice paradigm, which required kind of a steep learning curve for them, and it also required using a really complicated database. And so I kind of got hung up on the database and spent a bunch of time teaching the tool. And the assessments that I got from them indicated that they were still confused by the tool. The database was still really hard to use no matter what, but that they were also confused about evidence-based practice. And that caused me, and that was the case over a few different sessions. It wasn't even just one class. So I really had to coordinate with our health sciences librarian, with the faculty in that program. We developed a curricular approach toward building in the librarian throughout that course and their other courses. And we also decided that the librarians needed more evidence-based practice training in order to be able to teach the tool. So the students were assessing their own learning, and they were assessing the content of this one-shot But it turned out that their assessment results provided a lot of insights into how we as librarians approached the work, how students needed a lot more preparation before they were even ready to touch the tool, and how generally the librarians needed to be more integrated into the planning. So that would be kind of an extreme example. Often you think, oh, next time I need to remember to tell students how to use interlibrary loan, I'll do that. But sometimes it opens up a kind of a different approach to your work.
I know what database you're talking about, and it is a challenge to explain to some students exactly what you're doing in that database. Melissa, did you have any comments on that, or?
No, I don't have anything additional to add.
Okay.
I think we've shared a lot of our ideas on that.
Super. So is there an aspect of student learning that you dream of getting feedback on using a CAT?
Yeah, Amanda, if you would go to the next slide.
Sure.
Yeah, transfer and apply. This is really a favorite, and we've mentioned it already. And we've talked about the sort of time-bound nature of so much of what we do. So I really like using transfer and apply in a one-shot session. You know, I think that it can be useful to see what students got from that particular session and write down what they're going to do next time. But I would really like to use this in a longitudinal way to see how people really did apply what they learned and if that content really transferred successfully. We don't always have a chance to get that kind of longitudinal feedback from multiple formative assessments with the same students. You know, I've done that in credit-bearing classes, but I'm not currently teaching credit-bearing classes, and a lot of us don't. So that's kind of another dream that I have, to do this over the course of a semester and see what happens over time with students transferring and applying the knowledge. So that's one thing. I also mentioned with the goal ranking and matching exercise, I think that can also, you know, I also have dreams of using that over the long term to be really flexible about getting input on what students want to learn and sort of shaping the class around their goals and matching them to the content. So those are some of my big dreams.
Great. How about you, Cass?
I think that Melissa has really echoed what I would say, which is trying to use these ongoing formative assessments to get an idea longitudinally of what's working and how students really are learning and how we can best improve teaching and learning in the library.
Great. Sounds good. Yeah, that is a challenge, something I'd like to do as well. And sometimes I've been able to get information on a small scale, and every semester I try and push it up a little bit more. But the response rate when you're not face-to-face with students is sometimes a challenge too. So in summary, our last formal question, what are your top suggestions for using classroom assessment techniques?
This is Cass again, and I guess my overall top suggestion is it's not rocket science. This is not, I think sometimes we hear assessment and it's easy to think of a very formal, measured approach that would be suitable for publication or with sharing with your dean. And this isn't that. It's something you're doing to help students learn more and to make yourself a better teacher on the fly. It's nothing you have to write up and turn into anybody if you don't want to. It is important to act on it and to kind of close the loop a little bit, to use the cliche, but it's a pretty doable exercise. We also have a few other things about using these techniques. They're not just for assessment, they're teaching and learning, and I feel like we've emphasized that quite a bit today. They're formative, so they're really only giving you a glimpse of what these students know today. It's tempting to make generalizations based on these assessment techniques, but really they're just giving you information about a group of students in a time and place that may or may not apply to other students in a different time and place. And finally, they're context specific, which means they can and should be adapted to your own local needs. When we took out to write the book, of course, Angelo and Cross, who wrote the Bible on classroom assessment techniques, they were really careful to include examples from every discipline under the sun, disciplines that you would never think would use a formative assessment technique like this. They had such beautiful examples. And we were impressed by that, but we were less impressed that the book was written before online learning was a thing. So we really tried to adapt for adult learners, for online environments, for mixed environments, for hybrid courses. That said, there are things we didn't think of, and you all will be able to adapt these in ways at your library that we never dreamed of, or that make sense at your university that I would never use here in Wyoming. So I think that knowing they're flexible and you can adapt them to your own local context is really valuable.
And I would just like to ask all of you to actually take a moment to transfer and apply, because we really want this conversation to be useful to you. So you see the prompt on your screen, which is to first write down any intriguing ideas that came to you from this conversation, and then second, how would you adapt this for your own teaching? What might you apply? And if you want to just write this down, at your desk where you are, or if you have an idea you want to share in the comments, we would love to see it in terms of what you're going to try based on what we've talked about today.
Give folks a couple of minutes to do that. That's great. I'll give people another moment or so just in case you're writing things down or typing things in. Starting to see answers come in. This is fantastic. So we had a question, but what was the question again? So for today's session, Jennifer, write down intriguing ideas, techniques, and strategies and tactics from this conversation, and possible applications for your own teaching.
I'm really enjoying Anna's comment that this is a good way to describe assessment she might already be doing so that she can take it to the course development committee or to other folks who are invested in library instruction and be speaking the same language. I think that's such a valuable comment. This is a widely used approach by teaching faculty. Your Center for Teaching and Learning will know about classroom assessment techniques and will be able to provide additional resources for you and support for implementing them in your own teaching in most cases.
Yeah, that's a really great point. Sorry.
And Frances Brady just shared about doing this with peer teachers. We have peer research coaches too, and here at UNLV, and we've engaged them in some classroom assessment techniques, and they are helpful in terms of just like collecting information from students, because a lot of times when you do this kind of classroom assessment technique, you don't want to take away the worksheet or the activity that students have done, like transfer and apply, for example. I wouldn't necessarily want to collect this because I want students to take it away and have their notes about what to apply. But we've actually had peer research coaches like go around with a classroom iPad and snap pictures of what students wrote so that we can also see what it is they're going to apply, but students take away their own notes, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that's handy because when you end up with all that great feedback and then you think, oh, the student left without this,
they need
this
it.
might be helpful. Yeah, exactly. And I think you made an important there was an important point earlier. I think Cass made it about using the structures that are on your campus. And sometimes there might be some that you may not know about. So one of my colleagues had gotten us a set of Turning Point clickers a few years ago, and then there was another initiative on campus to bring in another classroom response tool. And it wasn't widely publicized, but when I went and talked to the folks over in our teaching and learning office, they were able to share that with me. And so as opposed to using this other technology that we had, there was another one that was starting to be rolled out, and I could follow on the coattails of that as well. So look around and see what's out there to help support what you're doing. So Great. So there's been some questions in the meantime, and people have posted some of their ideas and about what they'd like to, some tactics. So just as a reminder, we're going to start taking questions. And so when you are sending your questions, at least change that send to menu to all, if you can, to all participants. If you don't have that, all panelists is great. That way those of us who are on the panel can see the questions that you've added in. So I'm going to sneak back. Go ahead.
I saw a question about applying what you've learned from assessment techniques in multiple classes to instruction institution-wide. That's a place where I would do some more formal types of assessment, and I would do some summative assessment and some other ways of checking on your instruction program. Again, these classroom assessment techniques are a snapshot of one group of students in a day and time, and even if you can find similarities between what you collect from different classes, I think it's a little bit dangerous to extrapolate too much institution-wide just on these techniques. I'd want some additional evidence before making institution-wide changes. Melissa, you might totally disagree with me.
Well, I was thinking about that question, and one example that came to mind is a colleague and I at University of Wyoming, actually, where I was previously, we tried out using iPads in the classroom for concept mapping. So we had students using iPads versus pen and paper to create their concept maps of what their research question was, the different aspects of the research question. And we were doing it in the classroom. So I guess in a sense it was a classroom assessment technique, but then we were comparing those pen and paper maps to the iPad maps and found that students were much more thoughtful and thorough with the pen and paper. So that changed the way that we were, well, that focused the way that we were approaching it. We were, sort of going device-free with the concept mapping because students did a better job. But that is different from just gathering information about what students had learned. So yeah, I guess I really would agree with Cass that you need more than classroom assessment techniques to sort of make institution-wide decisions.
Great. There was one question in here about how much time do you end up spending on these? I'm looking to see when it was. Yes. So how much time do you spend on reflecting, closing the loop in your teaching and assessment?
I would say it depends. If you get feedback from a class of 25 and it's like a minute paper, I can pretty much get through that in 60 minutes. Go through their responses, make a list of the most common questions, send out an email. That's not tough. If you're getting something more thorough, like an RSQC2, where students are answering more questions and doing a little more reflecting, that takes more reflective time on the part of the instructor, too, to sort of see what's actionable, what you need to do. So it depends. That's a cop-out kind of answer. But I guess I would say, as much time as you spend in the classroom with the students, you should probably spend about that, at least that much time out of the classroom dealing with the responses and responding to what you gathered.
And this is Cass. We've been focusing a lot on how to follow up if students want more information or they missed something. But I've utilized these assessment techniques in classes where 99% of the students left knowing what I wanted them to know, and they didn't have real pressing questions. And in those cases, you can just follow up with the instructor and say, the results show that students were happy with the session, they got out of it what they wanted, but they can still find me at this email if they have more questions. So sometimes it's not a huge time commitment, but other times, like Melissa said, if you're collecting more data or you're planning it in advance, like a background knowledge check, or there's also some about what do I want to say, preconception checks, or sort of those feeling checks, how students feel about the library. Those require time at the outset and maybe less follow-up after.
Great. There's a related question about the RSQC2, which is how long do you wait before using that?
I guess that would depend too. It's not something that I really have ever used in a one-shot session myself. I've used it in multiple day workshops, and I've used it in credit-bearing courses. So it does take some time for students to connect. That's like one of the big points of that one. So they have to have some time built in to have made some connections between what they're learning. So that's not one that I've tried in a one shot. I don't know about you, Cass.
Yeah, I've only used it in workshops or credit courses where I knew or when I was embedded in the course and knew I would see folks regularly. So I would say a week or two is generally how I've deployed that one. I think anything more than a month, recall is going to get really sketchy and the exercise might not be as meaningful.
That's a good point. I've done it sometimes in upper level classes where I meet the students twice or three times during the course of the semester, and that it seems to work out okay with.
Yeah, that makes sense in that setting. Even like if you see them and then a couple weeks later you see them and ask them to recall, that could be pretty useful, pretty telling for you to know what they've retained over the last couple weeks.
What do I need to review this time?
Yeah.
Someone had asked if you use peer instruction to assess while also facilitating learning.
Peer instruction to assess. So like peer feedback?
Let's see, I'm hoping the questioner is still lurking out there in the audience. I'll look and see if there's a little follow-up.
Okay, well I'm just thinking about that. And one thing I have done in like first year composition classes even is have students write down their research question, do some thinking about it, and then turn to one another and give each other feedback. And I do think that can be useful to get some peer feedback, to talk to somebody, to have a conversation about your research topic, about your keywords, about your process, and students do get a lot out of that. And then in terms of assessing that, a lot of what I've done is just observation to see if students are making connections, are getting a little further along with their process. That's an interesting question.
I have used peers with the muddiest point before, asking students to write down what they're still confused about, and then collecting those and kind of sorting them back out to the group and having students answer each other's questions, or having them pair up and share what they're still confused about. Sometimes it turns out everyone's confused about the same thing, and other times there's people who just kind of drifted out for a minute, and the person sitting next to them can fill in the blanks.
Great. Just looking at some of the other questions that have come in. Let's see. So I'm not sure if you're able to see this particular comment in the panelists pane or in the chat pane, but the instructional technique of peer instruction. And that's, Eric Mazur, he's the professor, I think, at Harvard, who teaches engineering in large groups and shows, I think that might be one of the things that he shows in his in some of the videos he's done where he talks about flipped classroom learning. That might be worth investigating a little bit more. Let's see. What other ones do we have here?
I saw one about using transfer and apply with graduate students and professionals, and I really like that question. I think that group is adept at transfer and apply, largely because students early in their career might not know how they would transfer something or how they would apply it. Whereas if you're working with grad students and professionals, they might even be thinking of it as transfer and revise. Like, oh, I've been doing this one way for a long time, and now I'm going to revise my approach based on what I learned today. So I think, generally speaking, that is a really successful technique with those groups that have a little more experience under their belt of how they might use the information in a real-world setting.
I like that. Transfer and revise is a good one. We only have a couple of minutes left, so maybe one last question, which is, do you use multiple classroom assessment techniques in a single 60-minute session? Which work best together?
That's an interesting question, and my response is that at least recently, at least in the last couple years, I have tried to be selective about just sort of intentionally using maybe one, and that's in part to limit the amount of stuff I'm like handing out to students. I have had a tendency in the past maybe to overwhelm them with handouts. So if I can be selective and just give them, like one thing that I'd like them to complete and give back to me, or, one thing I'd like them to respond to, that's sort of the direction that I have veered recently, just so as to be focused, to focus their attention, because I don't want to be overwhelming them with too much stuff or too many requests for information.
Great. We have one last question maybe we can squeeze in, which a participant had asked. She says, I'd like to use case studies, one to two short paragraphs to introduce the problem for small groups and to attempt to solve for just a few minutes before starting the more formal instruction or objectives. Do you have other creative ideas for the classroom setup, like icebreakers and pre-assessments?
I like that case study idea.
Yeah.
That's great. I've used a kind of a confidence check. I did this with engineering, like freshman engineering students. Asked them in advance, anonymously, how confident they were with different things. And then when they arrived, I told them, only 40% of you have tried using Engineering Village before. And then, since they're engineering students, ask them to do a little bit of human rearranging and be like, how many of you is 40%? And like have them like go to different sides of the room, not identifying themselves, but just like, moving around a little bit and showing me, getting a visual on how many students had actually used it. So that's one warm-up that I did with engineering students based on confidence. I'm going to try case studies and a problem.
This is Cass. Thank you for saying confidence check. I was trying to search for that in my mind. But I like preconception checks too, where you have students react to statements about whether they're true or false. So some examples we've used are like, information is free, true or false, or everything online is indexed in Google, true or false, or, just things to set the stage and get students thinking critically about information and preparing for what kinds of information and questions they're going to answer during the session. But yeah, I agree, the case studies sound cool.
That's great. We are almost out of time, so I don't want to keep you any longer. But before we go, I do want to say that's a great use for Kahoot to do sort of like a true or false myth busting about research in the library if you're thinking about doing something like that. So we are about out of time, unfortunately. Let me just share one last thing.
Yes, and one last slide.
Yeah.
Could you just show
yes.
the last slide, please, Amanda? Thank you.
No problem.
There you go.
So those are the books, the book covers, including Classroom Assessment Techniques for Librarians and Classroom Assessment Techniques, the original book. So thank you, everybody, for being here at today's session. We would really appreciate your feedback. We have a short form I'm going to send out to you to evaluate this. Also, if you are dashing off someplace else, like many of us are, I'm sending the link in the chat, but we'll also follow up via email with the assessment. So I want to say thank you to our panelists, Melissa and Cass, and to everybody who helped make this possible, and to all of you for attending and sharing your great ideas. Thank you, everybody. Thanks for being here today.
Thanks, Amanda, for being a great moderator and for the invitation. This was really fun.
Oh, you're welcome.
Thanks a bunch.